Well, greetings fellow dwarfers, welcome back to another one of my episode breakdowns. We're sticking with series 1, kind of. We're doing a bonus today, the bonus episode being Bodysnatcher. This was a script originally written for season 1, it was gonna be produced, however, in the end, the creators decided to ditch this episode and replace it with the episode Me Squared. So this script kind of floated around, not being used until 2007, when it was turned into what we have today, an animated storyboard read by Chris Barrie, released on the Bodysnatcher DVD set. Now I really recommend you watch this if you haven't seen it already, there's versions on YouTube, just go search for them. Now previously this was actually an incomplete script, it didn't have an ending for it, so Rob Grant and Doug Naylor reunited in 2007 to rewrite the ending and reshape a few bits of the script that needed tidying up. So we're going to go through this like we would any other episode, except of course, not being filmed, there's no deleted scenes, and there's no remastered version. So what we're going to focus on mainly is bits of this script that we can see in other episodes, where they ditched the script for Bodysnatcher, but decided to use elements of it in other episodes of the series. Let's dive in and have a little look. So the episode begins with a short little section of the post-season freestyle intro music, no moody intro with Dave painting the side of the ship, and no Holly introduction, which is no surprise really. This episode was written long before they had decided to have Norman Lovett as an on-screen character, so this was probably written before the Holly introductions were ever a thing. And we get a really interesting opening for this one, which throws us straight to the climax of the episode, the end of the episode, before we're then taken back a few days, now curious to see how the story's going to unfold. Series 2's Stasis Leak would do kind of a similar thing, teasing some stuff that would be seen later. And in Season 7, Ouroboros would use the pub scene at the beginning and at the end. So this teasing opener shows us someone snoring loudly, and Lister putting a flare gun to his own head saying, "One of us has got to go." Before we then get a more usual Red Dwarf flyby shot with the caption 6 days earlier. Remember that number 6 for later, we'll come back to that. Lister is asleep in the bunk room in an armchair surrounded by filth. In the actual broadcast episodes there was some comfy looking seats underneath the window, but nothing that was quite an armchair. Holly announces that there's a Class A emergency happening and all crew need to report to General Assembly 4. Lister jumps up straight into a curry carton which wedges itself to his foot. And through all this, Lister is wearing a Muggs Murphy t-shirt. We'll see Muggs Murphy later in the episode. In the refectory, which must be where General Assembly 4 is, Rimmer is waiting for Dave at the head table. As Dave arrives, sits down and finally manages to extract his foot from that foil curry container. Despite the refectory being empty and Lister obviously being the only survivor of the radiation leak, Rimmer tries to take a long, boring roll call in order to establish the casualties from the radiation leak and to do things by the book. Arnold unnecessarily following rules despite the absence of any police, any JMC officials, or, well, anybody, is something we'll see plenty of times throughout the years. From the pod quarantine period in Waiting for God, to insisting on smoking areas in the near-empty cinema in Me Squared, to the many misquoted Space Corps directives in later series. And Rimmer making something completely pointless seem like it's a really serious emergency would be something we'd see in Series 6's fire drill scene. Before long, Lister gives up on this ridiculous spectacle and leaves, despite Rimmer's complaints. Our next scene is in a corridor where the cat arrives and does his whole "that's mine" sequence, in an almost identical way to how he did it in Confidence and Paranoia, almost word for word.
And this, all this, is mine, except for that.
He hops over a section of floor.
Don't want that bit.
I'm claiming all of this as mine. Except for that bit. I don't want that bit.
Rimmer comes along and the cat tries to make himself look big, just like he did in The End. Which, considering that the sequence in The End was a reshoot, I think it's a safe bet to say it was probably directly lifted from Bodysnatcher. Arnold strikes a martial art type pose, a bit like he did in The End in the teaching room, and makes an idle threat, counting to 5, then continuing on right up to 9, before pretending that he can hear a siren going off and making a sharp exit. In the drive room, Lister calls up something complex sounding to be played on a view screen, which turns out to just be a childish Muggs Murphy cartoon. We got to see a few seconds of a Muggs Murphy cartoon on screen in the cinema scene in Me Squared. Lister wrings out his curry-soaked sock so that it all goes back into the container it came from. Rimmer arrives and battles with Lister to verbally turn off the cartoon, before Rimmer shouts, "Destroy, erase, eliminate," causing the playback device to explode. Rimmer appeals for sympathy because he's dead, to which Lister weakly says, "It must feel awful," which only aggravates Rimmer even more. We get the first of 2 testicle jokes in this episode, this one being the hilarious fumbling with your date in the back of a car line. Dave invites Rimmer to get lost on the ship and pop back for 5 minutes on Christmas Day. Now, I've racked my brain on this one, but as far as I can recall, Red Dwarf has hardly ever actually referenced Christmas Day on screen before or since, with the exception of briefly seeing Santa in Meltdown. However, even there, it's meant to be a joke that he's in the wrong section of the theme park anyway. Presumably this was a conscious effort by the writers to not date any of the episodes to any particular time of year. Let me know if I'm wrong down in the comments down below, but I really can't think of Christmas ever being mentioned apart from Santa and Meltdown. As the conversation continues, Rimmer claims that Dave needs him, something that we'll come back to later. Rimmer gets Holly to reaffirm that Arnold was the most vital person to bring back as a hologram. But here it isn't explained why, it just says that Holly chose him as the most vital. We get a similar conversation between Dave and Holly in Balance of Power, but there, Holly did give a reason for why he selected Rimmer. Rimmer says that Lister is the flotsam of life, to which Lister claims not to be, before drinking the curry that he squeezed out of his sock. I can only imagine that if this had made it onto screen, it would have simultaneously become one of Dwarf's most iconic and sickening images. Lister says that he's the creme de la creme of flotsam, to which Rimmer corrects him and says it's supposed to be creme de la creme. We saw Crichton correcting the cat in a similar way in Season 5's Quarantine. Rimmer suggests some things that need doing on the way back to Earth, some of which are actually fairly reasonable sounding, like taking stock of everything on ship. Rimmer then says that he'll give it a few days and see who needs who on board ship. We then switch to the teaching room, where Rimmer is with 2 scutters trying to teach the scutters to write, with very little success, as they produce something which looks a bit like a Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock would be referenced by Lister in Season 3, Episode 6, The Last Day.
Told him it was a genuine Jackson Pollock.
Rimmer also mentions the scutters using sonic screwdrivers, which made me wonder if this had made it onto broadcast, would they have had to change that line to avoid clashing with Doctor Who? Just a thought. Rimmer then gets so frustrated that he orders the scutters to start hitting each other before one of them actually breaks down, to which Rimmer just blames the other scutter and tells him that he's going to have to fix him. We then see a ship flyby with the caption, 3 days later. In the bunk room, Dave's in his bunk, covered in junk, with an annoying Mexican whistler type tune playing. He's got an annoying talking alarm clock playing that tune, which is trying to wake him up for the 43rd time. The clock says it's from Titan, which the writers said is their kind of equivalent of things being cheap made in Taiwan. And being a cheap NAF device, it just ignores all of Dave's commands to stop. The alarm clock is so similar to Talkie Toaster that I'd almost say they pretty much just turned one character into another. It's basically exactly the same, even down to how the Talkie Toaster just keeps on offering toast when you told him not to. The alarm clock keeps trying to wake you up when you tell him to shut up. Dave then gets up and is completely bald. He goes to wash his face before doing a double take as he realises his hair is all gone. Dave getting a bit of a surprise with what he sees in the mirror is something that we saw in future echoes as well.
Rimmer, Rimmer!
Dave rushes back to his pillow and finds all the tufts of hair that have fallen out, or have apparently fallen out. And we get a joke that did make it directly onto screen, as Lister looks at his own reflection in the mirror and says, "Crap," making the toilet spin around exactly the same way that it did in Balance of Power.
Crap. A panel raises up in the wall and a lavatory bowl slides out. Not you.
Oh, crap. Not you!
In a panic, Dave then pathetically grabs all the remaining bits of hair and rushes to the medical unit. The medical unit is pretty much useless and no real help at all. A bit of a theme of this episode was kind of rubbish, annoying, cheap electronics. Chris Barrie doing the voice for the medical unit sounds a bit like when Tony Hawk's does the voice of various machines. However, to my ear, when Chris Barrie does this, it sounds just like the IT crowd's Moss.
There's fallen out. I see. I mean, like...
I see.
Also, the talking medical unit is something we wouldn't see on screen until Season 10's Father and Sons.
He should register. He's missing out on a whole raft of privileges.
As mentioned, the medical unit itself is pretty rubbish, as it was also made on Titan, just like the alarm clock. The unit then gives Lister a prescription of a ginger toupee called the Lounge Lizard 967. Before Lister gets angry and beats up the machine and breaks it, causing it to play the Mexican tune again, to which Dave just beats it again until it's completely dead. In the refectory again, Dave and Kat are sat down for a meal, and we hear what I think might be the cat's inner thoughts. Something we never see in Red Dwarf. We never hear anyone's inner thoughts. Although we do get the cat breaking the fourth wall in Series 2's Parallel Universe.
I don't know what that is, but I'm sure he wants to eat me.
The cat then steals Lister's food, but Dave's far too concerned about his hair to care about that. The cat taking advantage of others' misfortune in order to steal their food is something we'll see years later when Dave can't see anybody in MCOR. Rimmer arrives and shows suspiciously little interest in Dave's baldness, before calling him a talking testicle. After Rimmer leaves, Lister notices that the hair pile has no roots on it. He asks Holly about it, who says that it's fake hair, which Dave realises must have been put on his pillow by Arnold. We get another Red Dwarf flyby and then join a scutter going along a corridor at night. The scutter goes up to Dave's room and sneaks in, thinking Dave's asleep, and starts to reach across him. Dave isn't actually asleep, just pretending, but the scutter still manages to get in there, reach down, and pluck out most of one of Dave's eyebrows. I can only imagine how much that would hurt. The scutter races off, clutching the eyebrow with Dave chasing, while in the teaching room, Rimmer is waiting for the scutter to arrive and turns round to see Dave throttling the scutter. Furious, Dave threatens to have Arnold switched off, to which Rimmer then gives an explanation of his terrible plan to clone Dave using his hair. However, the daft scutters apparently shaved it all off, leaving all the roots behind, so Rimmer had to get his eyebrows plucked out instead. In the episode DNA, we briefly saw Rimmer trying to clone himself using an old flake of his dandruff, just before the cat ruined his plan completely.
Disappointments?
Rimmer explains that he thinks he can build himself a clone body because there's only 2% of the work needed, as humans are 98% water. Dave keeps calling Arnold a dangerous head-the-ball nutter, which I think's a great sounding insult. Deluded Rimmer thinks that he's the next logical step in human evolution and imagines a world full of Rimmers. A disturbing world indeed, and one we have seen in Season 6's Rimmer World. Lister is still going to turn off Rimmer, so Rimmer begs for 20 minutes before he's switched off, saying 20 minutes, the time it takes to make love 3 times and eat the pizza. Almost exactly the same line that he says in Series 2, Thanks for the Memory.
12 minutes, please? And that includes the time it took to eat the pizza.
In the drive room, Rimmer turns up to be switched off. This whole sequence is almost exactly the same as in Me Squared, with Rimmer in full dress uniform pointing out his long service medals. Rimmer tries to buy himself some extra time by trying to read a ridiculously long set of final words, but Dave cuts him off and just has him switched off there and then. Dave then asks Holly to load up Kachansky's holodisc, but unfortunately, Arnold booked out all the personality discs a few minutes earlier. Dave really shouldn't have given him those extra few minutes. If this episode had been made, it would have nicely explained how come Rimmer ended up being able to hide all of the crew's discs by the time we got to Balance of Power. The only disc available is one that Rimmer didn't know about because it doesn't belong to a member of the dead crew, because it's Dave's disc. Holly loads up that disc and the 2 Daves high five. Well, near enough. We then get a Red Dwarf flyby with a caption that says 5 days later, leading us into the same scene that we opened the episode with. The only problem is, that last caption said 5 days later, there was one before that said 3 days later, so that's 8 days, but As I told you to remember, the one at the start of the show said 6 days later, so somewhere we've gained or lost 2 days. So we now finally get to see the opening bunk room scene again that was shown at the beginning, with Dave holding a flare gun to his own head. The two Daves argue about how hard they are to live with some ridiculous examples, not just of Dave snoring, but of things like the ridiculous level of untidiness, the breaking wind, and the complete inability to read when the other person's getting annoyed. The living Dave gets so frustrated that he shoots at the hologram Dave using the flare gun, but of course, being a hologram, the flare goes straight through him and sets the bunker light. They look around and can't find a fire extinguisher, so read the fire instructions on the wall. However, Dave had previously swapped those with Mickey take instructions to annoy Rimmer. The living Dave finally realises that he does need Rimmer, and has Holly swap back the discs, reviving Arnold. Rimmer panics for a moment before beginning to help Dave find the extinguisher. Rimmer had previously alphabetized everything in the room, so the extinguisher is in the F for fire section, and actually ends up being inside the fridge. They find the extinguisher in the fridge but waste loads of time discussing this ridiculous alphabetizing system. Dave then puts out the fire following Rimmer's terrible instructions to start at the top, which is totally wrong. Every fire extinguisher I've ever looked at says point at base of fire. But the fire does go out and the two admire the now wrecked room. Rimmer convinces Lister to keep him turned on, saying they make a great team. And as we can see on the storyboard, Rimmer puts his arm on Dave's shoulder, except, of course, being a hologram, his arm's actually sticking straight through Dave instead. The final scene is what Rob Grant calls a reflective ending, where it mirrors the start of the episode, with Dave once again rushing to the refectory in an emergency, with some food stuck on his foot, this time a pizza. And once again, it turns out to be not an emergency at all, just another pointless Rimmer roll call due to the fire the night before. Rimmer is trying to hold an impartial witch hunt, similar to how Rimmer calls a meeting to blame Dave for losing Red Dwarf in Season 6's Sirens.
We have lost Red Dwarf. This is not the time for small-minded, petty recrimination. The time for that is when we get back to Earth and Lister is court-martialed.
And is it just me, or does Rimmer, trying to be really official doing all this, remind anyone else of Britas?
Beauty, atmosphere. 8 o'clock, not before.
And finally, realising that he's still stuck with the same annoying Rimmer, Dave starts to bang his head on the table. And that's it for Bodysnatcher. A really fun little episode. Okay, we don't get any visuals of the actual people. It's all just storyboards, but I really enjoy Bodysnatcher. I'd love to know what other people think of this episode. I can see a few reasons though why this wasn't produced. Not only had they not completed the script, and they thought Me Squared was a better script, but also, if Me Squared was a challenge to film, this would have been a nightmare. You see, whereas in Me Squared, Chris Barrie was able to immediately switch to play either of the two Rimmers, as they were both identical, Craig Charles would have had to spend hours in makeup getting a bald wig applied every time he needed to switch parts. It could have been a right nightmare. Plus, that fire scene would have brought its own expensive complications to filming. So I can see why this one wasn't made. It's a shame though, I think it's a really cool episode. Who knows, perhaps they'll use some more of this one day. But I've really enjoyed going through this one and seeing bits that have influenced other episodes. Obviously, the entire thing of having two Listers is very, very similar to Me Squared, where you've got two Rimmers. Obviously, a big influence on Me Squared. But you have to wonder if other elements of this episode, like the cloning, I wonder if that had some influence upon the later DNA episode. Possibly so. But I'd love to know what you guys think. Can you see a lot of stuff here that influenced other episodes that I haven't thought of? Do you enjoy Bodysnatcher? Do you think this was good? Let me know in the comments below. I'd really like to know what you guys think. Guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this slightly different look at a slightly different type of episode. If you've enjoyed this, I'd love it if you could give us a thumbs up. If you're not subscribed, I'd love to invite you to do so. And if you haven't hit the bell icon so that you get notifications, consider doing that. Guys, thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time, Smugheads.